So welcome again. Today we're gonna see the development of the cardiovascular system. This lecture will be split in two. So first we're gonna see how the heart develops and then how the vessels develop. So as the embryo grows, it becomes more difficult to get nutrition by simple diffusion. So by the middle of the third week, progenitor heart cells of the epiblast migrate to the visceral layer of the lateral mesoderm and form the primary heart fill that you can see in figure A of an embryo seen from above. Okay, so this is figure A is the embryo seen from above. Then figure B depicts a transverse cut where the primary heart fill lies at both sides of the lateral visceral mesoderm. These cells will give rise to part of the heart that include the atria, the left ventricle, and part of the right ventricle. Okay, so the red line is the primary cardiogenic field. Then the rest of the heart, including the rest of the right ventricle and the outflow tract of the heart, arises from a secondary heart fill of the visceral mesoderm just ventral to the pharynx. That outflow tract will divide into the conus cordis and the truncus arteriosus. We'll go back to this later. The right and left side of the embryo is established at the moment of migration of the progenitor heart cells, and that happens by day 16. So you know that, for instance, the aortic arch normally bends to the left. Okay, so this is established at this day. After this migration, the pharyngeal endoderm induces those cells to differentiate into cardiac myoblasts or heart muscle cells and blood islands responsible to give rise to blood cells and new vessels. Later we'll see that the creation of new blood cells is a process named vasculogenesis. Then following, the islands merge together to form a horseshoe-shaped tube called the cardiogenic region that will give rise to the heart. These blood islands also form a couple of dorsal longitudinal vessels called the dorsal aorta that you can see in this sagittal figure. And you see they are depicted in red, and they have an artery coming from the yolk sac, okay, which is the vitelline artery, and also there is an artery coming from the placenta where the embryo gets nutrition and oxygen. Later, the horseshoe-shaped tube merge in a limited region, forming a unique tube with the two aorta coming out from the cranial end, and two veins arriving to its caudal end. So let's see how that happens in a different image. So here, in figure A, you have the two tubes separated, and then the tube merges into a unique tube in the center, and that represents the primitive heart. Then the tube expands, forming the outflow tract cranially from where the blood is pumped to the dorsal aorta, and the recently formed first aortic arch. Caudally, the expansion forms the ventricular regions that receive the venous drainage from the body. As the recently formed myocardium expands, it secretes the cardiac jelly of hyaluronic acid, and in the meantime the endothelium remains as a deeper layer. Simultaneously, mesenchymal cells located in the mesocardium that attaches the cardiac tube to the dorsal wall form the proepicardial organ. These cells will proliferate and migrate to cover the myocardium and will become the third outermost layer that is called the epicardium, which is a kind of a bag that contains the heart. From this structure, the epicardium, the coronary arteries that nourish the heart will arise as the heart grows bigger. Remember that the dorsal mesocardium arises from the secondary heart fill and that a ventral mesocardium is never formed. So later on, that dorsal mesocardium will also disappear, so the adult heart is suspended in the thoracic cavity, only attached by the great vessels coming in and out of the heart. Now, the tube continues to elongate inside the pericardium sac. So here happens that the greater growth of the tube in comparison with the pericardium forces the tube to initiate a looping process, which is essential to develop a normal heart. If this process goes wrong because is inhibited or for any other reason, a series of malformations will happen, being the most frequent what is known as the tetralogy of Fallot, which is characterized by aortic stenosis, ventricular septal defect, right ventricular hypertrophy, which means that the right one is bigger, and an overriding aorta, meaning that both ventricles have their outflow in the aorta, the right and the left one. So here babies get cyanotic, which means they get blue color because they don't get proper oxygenation. They may even lose consciousness, and they also may die. So bending of the heart tube begins in day 23 and finishes at day 28. The superior part of the tube, you have it in the first image depicted with, there is an arrow, yellow arrow pointing down and a bit, so it's pointing caudally. It is supposed to point also ventrally and to the right side, while you see the one in the bottom, which corresponds to the atrial portion or inflow of the heart, will bend dorsally, cranially or superiorly, and to the left. See here. Alright, so this is how the tube bends. At the same time, the part of the tube corresponding to the atria and to the ventricles expand and become bigger. So the paired atrial part, initially outside the pericardium, fuses in a common atria and is incorporated into the pericardium. So the connection of this part with the ventricular part is known as the atrioventricular junction, remains narrow as an atrioventricular canal. So the initial third of the bulbus cordis, which is here in the outflow of the tube, of the bended tube, also known as conus cordis, also expands to form a part of the right ventricle. The mid part will form a common outflow for the two ventricles, and the distal part, most superior, known as truncus arteriosus, still one artery, but later will divide and form the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. Although the left ventricle and the bulbus cordis, that will become the right ventricle, are communicated, the junction is narrow and is known as the primary interventricular foramen. Okay, more or less where this second, the middle black arrow is. This foramen will disappear in the born baby as soon as the truncus arteriosus divides into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. But by now there is only one outflow, so the ventricles need to be continuous for the blood to flow out. So at this point we can distinguish a right and a left primitive atrium and a right and a left primitive ventricle. Atria and ventricles still communicate with each other by means of foramina. Okay, and here you have a video where we see the right atrium and ventricle. Okay, well, both chambers are communicated, but first you'll see that an atrioventricular septum is going to separate the atria and the ventricles. You see that growing in the center, right? Okay, so the arrows show how the septum grows and separates the atria from the ventricles. Then a muscular interventricular septum begins to separate both ventricles. Okay, so the left ventricle is behind. Now we are seeing only the right ventricle. And simultaneously an interarterial septum primum separates the atria, leaving a narrow communication that is called the foramen primum. But then this foramen obliterates while the foramen secundum appears. And the last thing is that septum secundum grows and is going to cover the foramen secundum that becomes the foramen ovale, that acts as one sense valve. So the blood can only pass from the right atria that we are seeing now to the left atria that is behind the foramen ovale. So the foramen secundum between these two atria, that foramen will remain there until the very first respiration of the baby. Okay, when the baby takes air inside for the first time, the valve sticks to the wall and the foramen closes. Okay, so now what we are seeing is the septum between the two ventricles, okay, and the common outflow, which is the truncus arteriosus. So we make it now transparent, so we can see that the final separation of the interventricular septum depends upon the development of a spiral septum that bifurcates the truncus arteriosus into the aorta, which comes from, you'll see that later, the fourth aortic arch, and the pulmonary artery that comes from the sixth aortic arch. Okay, so you see how that septum, spiral septum, is growing down and finally closes the foramen between the two ventricles, so they get separated. So now this right ventricle we are seeing has an outflow through the pulmonary arteries, and the left ventricle that is behind has its outflow through the aorta. So the result is the separation of the two ventricles, okay, and their outflows. The aorta for the left ventricle and the pulmonary artery for the right ventricle. And I don't know if this video, no, now you'll see how the blood flows out. That's the left ventricle to the aorta, and from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. Okay, so that's how these the ventricles get separated. And now we'll see a couple of images of different stages of the development of the heart. So see how close is to the future hemispheres. So the two the tissue you can see here on top are the future brain hemispheres, and what you have in the center of the image is the ventricle and the outflow. Okay, so the venous poles, they are still caudal, and they will now turn behind the ventricles and come on top of the image. Okay, and in this here it evolved a bit more. You still have the left ventricle in the center of the image, the outlet, and that corresponds to the future right ventricle, and the atrium is still caudal but is beginning to turn and will finish with a position cranial to the ventricles.
Initially, the heart consists of a simple tube. It's anchored at one end by the differentiating arterial trunks, and at the other by extensive venous channels which drain into the atrium. Being fixed at both ends, the cardiac tube grows rapidly in length, and the embryonic ventricle is bent into a loop to the right of the midline. As development continues, the ventricular region swings back to the midline and expands and grows in length to cover the atrium and great veins. Extensive saculations projecting laterally will ultimately become the right atrium and left atrium. The future left ventricle lies to the left of the interventricular groove, and the embryonic right ventricular or bulboconus region communicates with the truncus arteriosus. A four-chambered heart is formed from this convoluted tube by the development of three septa, partitioning the atria, the ventricles, and the truncus arteriosus. Although these septa develop simultaneously, they will be considered individually. By viewing the heart from the right side, partitioning of the atria and ventricles can be more easily visualized. Externally, a deep groove separates the atrium from the ventricle. Within the heart, the atrioventricular groove appears as a deep invagination, which constricts the atrioventricular canal at its waist. The canal becomes divided along its longitudinal axis by two partitions, growing from the walls of the two common chambers toward the auricular-ventricular junction. Endocardial cushions extend from opposite sides of the atrioventricular aperture and ultimately fuse into a column dividing the channel between the atrium and ventricle. From the interventricular ridge, a proliferating muscular septum advances across the common ventricle toward the base of the heart. Simultaneously, the interatrial septum rapidly grows toward the endocardial cushions, progressively constricting the foramen between the atrial chambers, the foramen primum. Before the foramen primum becomes obliterated, a new opening appears, high on the interatrial septum. The timely development of this orifice, the foramen secundum, provides uninterrupted shunting of blood from the right atrium directly into the left. Another interatrial septum, the septum secundum, develops from a ridge just to the right of the septum primum and extends down like a curtain over the interatrial fenestration.
Okay, and here you have those videos that show in a quite a fast way how everything evolves. Okay, so this video and the previous one, you have them in the VLE full length, so you can check them out. And just not to make this video too long, that's gonna be all for the heart development. Alright, so see you in a while.